associate. So I have joined by Kishonna L, an associate professor at the University of Kentucky, and two, joined by Taha Ibaid. Then I'm also joined by Tanner, who is an associate professor at Ontario Tech. And finally, Nick from Spiritfarer Games. If you all want to give a short introduction, starting with maybe Kishonna, and then we can probably take from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Is everybody hearing me okay? Want to make sure that's good. Awesome. It's so exciting to be here. Kishonna L, former Sun Devil, always a Sun Devil. Let me say that. I got my PhD there in 2011 in Justice Studies, so the School of Social Transformation. I don't think it was called that when I was there, but anywho, I'm now an associate professor at the University of Kentucky in writing, rhetoric, and digital studies, and I research video games, and I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for allowing me in and allowing me to share space with you all. Thanks.
All right, let's go with Tanner next. Introduction. It is. Oh,
hello, everybody. Really nice to be here in class with you today. Really delighted and honored for the invitation and to be here with such esteemed panelists. My name is Tanner Mirrlees, and I'm from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I'm an associate professor in the Communication and Digital Media Studies at Ontario Tech University. And I study things like war games and the history of empires and communication and a bunch of other stuff. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
And we have Taha next, who's also from Ontario Tech.
Hi, everyone. My name is Taha. I'm super excited to be here. I am actually half American because I was born there, so I'll take that. But I am in Canada. So yeah, I worked under Tanner actually during my MA. I'm a graduate of Ontario Tech U. I did my MA in criminology, and I studied the depiction of Muslims and Arabs within war-themed video games. And I'm super excited to hear more from the other panelists here and questions from you guys later. Thanks.
All right, and then last but not least, joined by Nick, who is the lead developer and lead writer for Spiritfarer and also works at Thunder Lotus Games.
Right, yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here as well with such a cool event. I think it's really important to discuss such a topic in universities. I'm Nick, and I was a creative director on Spiritfarer, a cozy management game about dying that we shipped last year in August 2020. And yeah, I was also lead writer on the project at Thunder Lotus Games. And again, I'm really happy to be here. So yeah.
So now that we know more about our panelists and where they're from and what they do, I just wanted to ask a question just so that everyone around here better knows what your place is in this in our project. So just basically, if each of you can just explain like basically what and why you like did what you have done and like research about our general topic that we're doing. So just so that everyone can understand your part in our project.
I love origin stories. I'll start. Oh my goodness. I think most of us are probably lifelong gamers in here, right? And so I think there was a moment for a lot of us where we realized first off that we can translate what we love into the thing that we do for like a living, right? And for me, that happened in graduate school. So I was in Wilson Hall. I don't even think Wilson Hall is ever occupied anymore ever, which is sad. But I was in Wilson Hall and my office mate was studying like video games. And I was like, how you study video games? Like who let you get away with this? And so he was telling me about this cool ethnography. I didn't know what ethnography was. I was just acting, I was faking it till I made it, right? So I was like, oh yes, ethnography. Had no idea what that meant, but he was doing an ethnography of EverQuest. And I thought it was just fascinating, you know, how he was just, you know, applying these academic concepts to these virtual worlds. And I was like, I want to do that too. You know, I didn't know we could do that, you know, because at the time I had a really heavy project. So I started graduate school right when Hurricane Katrina happened. And I was doing a project actually on how Black folks utilize like social media. We didn't call it social media at the time, but they were utilizing comment sections, MySpace and Black Planet. They were using that to really like reconnect with like loved ones. So I was really looking at how networks were created and formed because people were displaced. You know, there were people trying to find loved ones that were in Texas and Florida. And you all probably have no idea what I mean when I say Hurricane Katrina, but it was a really intense moment for a lot of us. It was like a 9/11 moment, you know, for like a lot of us, you know. So so I realized that people stopped caring, and I realized that the heaviness of that, I was like, I don't know if I want that to be like what I do as an academic pursuit. That would be like more of like my activist life, right? So, and because I wanted to just have like a break from the heaviness of those kinds of things. And so I was like, I want something fun. And I said, especially after my mentor said that whatever you do for your dissertation, you're going to be doing it for the next 10 years of your life. Now I've reached that 10-year point. It wasn't that bad, but at the time I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be awful. So I wanted to make sure that it was always fun and always engaging. But the moment that I knew what I needed to do, I was in Gears of War, and I wasn't on the mic, but I popped the mic on and I started talking, and, you know, people were really mean to me. By mean, I mean really racist and really sexist. And I was like, why are you doing this? And so I kind of translated that into like a class project, you know, looking at, you know, online communities and how people experience, you know, a lot of the oppressions in those spaces. So that's how I got here. That's what started it all for me.
Thank you. Tanner, if you can share your story.
Sure. I mean, I've been playing games since I was a little person. I think it was like Kojiko, then Atari, then sort of Nintendo, then Sega Genesis, then Super Nintendo, then PS1 through 4. I'm not on 5 yet. And some computer games too, but my PC gaming friends always say that I'm sort of not as sophisticated as they are because I'm still on some consoles and such. But you know, I grew up, I guess, on what you'd call sort of a border town of the United States, about 22 minutes down the road from Buffalo, New York, and always, you know, visiting some sort of family members in the US and elsewhere. And I, you know, was playing war games, and then I sort of looked at sort of the instruction manual to the back of, you know, SOCOM 2 Navy SEALs, and I noticed embedded within that instruction manual was a direct recruitment pitch from the actual US Army and the SEALs. And I was like, whoa, what's the relationship between, you know, wargaming and actual sort of war? And so that was a question that I had when I was doing my PhD at York University. But this was also sort of the time in which I was coming of age, I guess, as a peace activist, you know, post 9/11 with the launch of the global war on terror and the contentious lead up to the sort of US invasion of Iraq and such. I sort of, you know, jumped into the peace movement and was like marching on streets and protesting and trying to bring a stop to that war before it happened, kind of having a sense of, you know, how calamitous and destructive that would be. And also, you know, be bad for the folks of Iraq, of course, but also sort of not very positive for the United States as a whole. And so then I was sort of looking at sort of the links between popular culture and representations and simulations of war and actual war it was being, you know, played out. And then sort of, you know, just as the US was launching its sort of attack on Baghdad, you saw, you know, Desert Storm 2, Back to Baghdad is a video game, you know, where civilians are playing alongside the actual military virtually. And I just said, what's happening? And I sort of really jumped into research at that point that also connected with my peace activism at the time. So that's where I started, I guess.
Thank you. If we can pass the screen time to Taha.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, my name is Taha, as I said earlier. For me, Kishonna, it's kind of interesting hearing your origin story and seeing the parallels between your story and mine in some kind of ways. So I will be doing a little bit of plagiarism here. But essentially, when I was a kid, being Muslim and Arab myself, I played a lot of video games when I was younger, I still do. Nintendo 64 was my favorite one. I played a lot of PlayStation 1, 2, and 3. Never had an Xbox, just because I don't know, just never got to that. And now I have a PC. But as a kid, I played a lot of games, and Call of Duty was one of the biggest ones. Actually, it still is pretty big. And I remember I was probably 12 years old. And when you're a kid, maybe you're not so critical of the things you're doing and the games you're playing. So we were playing Call of Duty, and being Arab Muslims ourselves, we're playing the main storyline. And we literally run into a village where there's Arabic writing on the wall, and you end up shooting civilians and things like that. And you hear them yelling in Arabic because we speak Arabic. I could understand what they're saying. They say Allahu Akbar and things like that. And at the time, I didn't think much of it. I thought to myself, oh, it's just a game. And my sister walks in, who's older than me, and she kind of shamed me at the moment and said, why are you playing this game? Why are you, killing our own people? And I kind of fought her on that because I was just a 12-year-old playing games. And it wasn't until way later on, during university in my 4th year of my bachelor's degree, when me being a criminology student, I actually took an elective in communications. And when you know it, Tanner Mirrlees was the professor for that course. And it was called Entertainment Goes Global. It was about how basically the entertainment films industry and games industry, how pervasive it could be and the influence it has basically on society and the world as a whole. And that really got me thinking back to what my sister was saying in the video games that I used to play, because it really kind of put it into perspective to me of how pervasive these games can be, the audiences they're reaching. It's all about encoding and decoding texts and stuff like that. So it really got me thinking. And then the following year, I sat with Tanner and we talked because I knew I wanted to work with him on my thesis. And we both came to the realization that this actually gives us a good opportunity to kind of connect both of our worlds with criminology and communications. And it gave us a way, or at least me a way, to kind of readdress and reapproach those video games that I used to play earlier from maybe the perspective of my sister, who was being critical, and now I was doing it in an academic setting, to kind of jump into them myself and play them again, but this time from a more critical point of view. So that's my villain origin story, or I guess hero origin story. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, Nick, take it over.
Well, those are really cool stories. I don't know if I can actually match these, but I'm French. I was born in France. I'm quite old. I was born in 1980, and to give a bit of a background, I was born on the French Riviera in a town called Nice. And my father was from French descent, but he was growing up in Morocco. So he, in France, we call those people the Blackfeet. No, absolutely no relation with the indigenous tribe from the North America, but still people who basically grew up in North Africa and then went back to France. So he's always had some funky vision of immigration in general. I'd say it's generally a problem in France, and southern France in particular. So I guess from a very young age, I developed quite a critical eye towards everything that is either colonialism and or at least imperialism as an idea in terms of continental story and history. Now, completely unrelated, 26 years later, I joined Electronic Arts in Montreal in Canada, where I still live to this day. And I've been making games for 16 years, now a bit. I've made some terrible games. I've made some good games. When I was in EA, I was working on a game called Army of Two. I don't know if some of you guys have played it. It was a terrible game made by people who looked at things from a very, Westerner perspective, and it was quite tactless. And more and more, happened to me in my career. I was fortunate enough to join the Assassin's Creed games at Ubisoft. I shipped a number of them from AC2 to AC Revelation to AC Unity Bar. I shipped a bunch of them, and it was a bit better for me as a history buff to actually, being involved in those worlds and being involved in the story that still involved a lot of killings, and that was a bit of a problem for me. But still, it evolved from there, and I joined Thunder Lotus, which is an indie company, 3 years ago to ship Spiritfarer, and that's about it. Yeah, in terms of, I have a very, again, skeptic eye towards the either gaming industry and or gaming communities. So it's, I think it's interesting to look at the games from both who are making them and who are playing them. So yeah.
Thank you all for sharing your stories. I'm going to pass the mic to David here.
Thank you. So you all have kind of answered the first question, which is why is it important to address issues of race in video games? You all have kind of done a very good job through your origin stories of answering that question. So I'm going to skip to the next one, which, Nick, you started to get at. But how do you all deal with issues of cultural appropriation within your work? So like what you were talking about, Nick, with having,
That's a sign for me
Nat-
to pick up the ball, right? You're just sending that question towards me right now.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
I'm setting that question toward everybody, but Nick, if you want to start, that would
Sure.
be great.
Yeah, it's terribly complicated, and to be honest, I don't really know. It's a complex thing for me, specifically because I'm a straight white man, as you can see right now. I was born in France. I come from a place of privilege, moderate privilege. I'm not the son of, I'm not a prince or son of a CEO, but still, I fully acknowledge who I am, and it's a sensitive topic. That being said, as I said, I'm French, so I guess we have a slightly different opinion of this. It's from a cultural perspective, I always thought that it has to be made with tact and in only very specific context. So from a player's perspective, it's something I actually look at. I've been playing Ghost of Tsushima last year. I'm a fan of Japanese history and Japanese, tales in general. And I was looking at the game and thinking that, yeah, they did a very good job at trying to be respectful of the culture they were trying to emulate within the game and the game world. It worked, but I don't think I could have made the game myself. I would have felt too non-legitimate trying to tackle this. It's a very complex opinion. It's a sensitive topic among creators, to be honest. Many people would say that we can't talk about everything and it's fine, and many others are thinking, yeah, actually no, you can't. You have to dig into your own background and make sure that the stories you're telling or the gameplays you're trying to make in your game kind of still work with your own background as a person, and you can't really express something that is not your own. So it's complicated, yet I feel it would be a bit of a shame to not try to actually do something and to feel restrained by your own cultural boundaries all the time. I don't have a very, I could talk about this for hours again, but it's a very complex topic. I mean, again, as creators and I'm a regular at GDC. We talk among creators, and we are always asking ourselves, what do we actually do? What are the topics we can actually talk about? What are the things we can actually, again, legitimately tackle and not feel, imposters there, or waiting on territories that we feel are unsafe or that should not be talked this way. It's a bunch of things. And again, we're not lonely persons. Each video game studio, each video game itself is made by teams. It's very rare that it's made by a handful of people. It can still happen, but still, generally, it's a number of people that can share different backgrounds, that can share different ethnicities, of course, genders. Even if, again, in the video game industry, it's a bit of a problem. We are massively, the creators are massively white men doing games, which is evolving and changing, but still the norm right now. So yeah, it's a whole bunch of things, but at the core, I believe it's creators have to ask themselves honestly if they are legitimate, basically working on a subject that is not exactly in their cultural upbringing, basically. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on this.
Is it okay if I jump in there?
Of course.
Okay, awesome. I love that question. I love the question that you all just asked. I think it's a question that's like, we need to ask like two questions before we get to that question though. Like, because I think you're assuming a lot about developers and designers. You're assuming that they know what cultural appropriation is. And you're assuming that they know what a stereotype is. And you're assuming that they recognize like the harms that the video games might actually produce and might cause. I'm going to go back to what Taha said, just a few seconds ago about how he's a 12-year-old kid just playing a game because he loves the game, right? And it really took some years later, but also his sister to serve as like an intervention to be like, okay, there's some problematic representations here, right? And I think that's kind of like where we are for a lot of like designers and creators, that they don't even recognize the power that they have, like the power of the imagery that gets deployed on our screens, like just how powerful it is, right? Because so many people say, okay, so what's wrong with having all these, having Middle Eastern terrorists? What's wrong with having Black drug dealers? Like, it's just the game. It's not that serious. But whenever you have these images that are compounded upon and multiplied like upon one another, so even think about like right after like 9/11, think about all the movies. I'm thinking about, what was it, 24? I'm thinking about all the shows, all the movies, all the video games. So we were being inundated with this Islamophobia, with this imagery of like, like the brown Middle Eastern dude's the bad guy, right? And even prior to that, like in the 90s, think about all the black dudes as drug dealer, brown, Latinx, men as like, drug dealers and cartel, and like, so you have to think about like it's not a single story that's being told. When you're constantly fed and constantly inundated with those images, we have to like get the message to the gaming industry somehow that those images matter, that people are like taken in like a lot of people don't have a critical lens, from which they're viewing the world. So they may look at that and say, oh, that's actually true. That brown dude named Muhammad, he actually is like a terrorist, or Jamal, Jamal is, whatever black stereotype you got for Jamal. Like, and so I think that the gaming industry doesn't realize that they are a part of like the social commentary, and that the things that they're creating actually matter, and that the images that we're being fed, it's not just like a singular story that's being put out there. It's that story on top of what the other media tells us, on top of what our families have to say, on top of what our countries are saying and doing, right? I just read just on Twitter right now about Biden, re-implementing like the Trump thing with the asylum seekers, saying, hey, no, y'all got to stay in Mexico. You can't come here. That goes against what asylum seeking is. That goes against like the human rights. And Tanner can speak more to that, about, like the human rights case. But I think that's where, like we're starting at a question that a lot of designers and developers, because what I heard from Nick, that was very nuanced. That was more nuanced from what we hear from a lot of these companies. Like those aren't the conversations that folks are having. So Nick is like ahead of the game, when it comes to this, and hopefully people around him like are listening and paying attention. I'm stopping there. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I guess I can comment there if it's fine. I think, Kishonna, you brought up a really good point about how a lot of the people, and especially, developers in the industry, aren't really aware of the effects and the stereotypes. And I think for me, and this might not be applicable for everyone, but for me, a key word that used to come up, or I guess comes up, is cognitive dissonance. And that's for myself as a Muslim and an Arab, right? When I was younger, as I said, I used to play these games. And I myself, even being within, being the one technically represented, I myself wasn't even really cognizant of it, or I kind of was, but I was playing the excuses in my head. And so I think that when it comes to, addressing this whole idea of cultural appropriation within these games, not only do we, of course, want developers and the people producing these to be mindful of them, but we also, I guess it starts with ourselves as well. And that's why I said it might not apply to everyone, but for me, I did experience cognitive dissonance. And so a big step for me was learning how to inform myself of what's happening within these games and their potential consequences in some way or another. And so that's why I feel that with the project that Tanner and I have done with our work was a really good step for me to inform myself and kind of reduce that level of cognitive dissonance in terms of these representations and the culture appropriation in these games. And sure enough, through an ethnography of play, again, Kishonna, I'm doing a lot of plagiarism here. You mentioned ethnography before, which means basically when it comes to ethnography of play, it's when we're asserting ourselves inside of these video games and seeing them for ourselves, playing them ourselves. That was, for me, the best way that I could really analyze these games in a way that was totally different from how I did it when I was younger. Because when I was younger, I played them just kind of for fun. When it came to the thesis that I was doing during my MA, I was now doing them with a, like Kishonna said, a more critical lens. So yeah, educating myself, I think, was the biggest step that or at least the first step that I could take towards addressing culture appropriation, which was accepting that it exists within these games. And then, of course, we can go on about what the next steps can be in terms of addressing it for other people, which I'll touch basic on later. But that's essentially starting with reducing cognitive dissonance is where I started with on that topic.
Can I jump in just quickly as well, friends? Yeah, I mean, and I really appreciate all the points that have been made. I mean, especially Kishonna's about how, like, sort of, the designers, the programmers, the encoders themselves might not be entirely reflexive or aware of the extent of the harm that these stereotypes cause in the actual world of society, of the geopolitics of the US as a superpower. And I think it's also important to note that sort of the workers within these industries are translating or transcoding already existing sort of racial stereotypes and oppressive stereotypes and sexist stereotypes that are already part of the broader media culture and the society that spawns them, right? And so, you know, there's been stereotypes of sort of Arabs and Muslims in the media for a very, very long time. I mean, Jack Shaheen wrote a good book called Real Bad Arabs, and you see how sort of another wing of the entertainment industries kinds of like sort of picks that up and then sort of translates that into yet another stereotypical narrative featuring sort of these, you know, this othering process. And so I just like wonder, like, well, I'd be really curious to know sort of what folks think though about that level of consciousness of the workers within these industries, and sort of, has there been a change that's occurred? Have people become more aware due to the activism that's happening in society? You know, sort of from activism sort of by Muslim Americans to sort of Black Lives Matter to sort of, you know, other entities that are, you know, raising consciousness about these problems. I mean, has this had any impact on the industry, or are we seeing any changes?
If I may pick the ball here, yes and no. It's again quite complicated because, well, first, I come from the indie space now, which means people in my space, people who are in smaller companies who do, who actually craft smaller games, quote unquote, because they're really not that small, but still, come from a younger generation in general. But the thing that we must never forget is that the gaming world is still in industry, in the sense that people making games still want to, in general, want to make a huge amount of money out of them. It's a self-serving thing in which white people will do things for white consumers, and people will actually try to, well, they won't try to actually change the status quo, because you'll see this as, this is what sells, this is a community that's been there, we need to serve them. Taha, you were mentioning Call of Duty, which is the kind of games which is, again, propagating maybe less and less, but still stereotypes about, I'm not even talking about race stereotypes of cultural appropriation stereotype, but even like the action of violence. I'm not against violence video game, I'm just saying that it's more of a consumerist approach rather than an artistic approach. We try to change things bit by bit, and honestly, I think, and it's not a burden because I would never say that, but it's more on the audience to change things. It's more like if people buy more games that are more interesting, or less, you know, racially stereotypical or cultural appropriating other types of cultures, then yes, maybe we will strive to make a change, and then it's incremental. You know, industry makes a step, and then the consumers make a step, and then it goes on and on and on, and then the industry changes, and the market changes, and then we can go away from the feeling that we've had for the last 10 years that we are actually us kind of a weird Fox News in the entertainment, and then we only sell games to people who like violence and racial stereotypes, which was my feeling for the last decade, maybe the last decade, but maybe a bit before. So yeah, it's I think yes, Tanner. I think the industry as in itself is a bit changing. It's easy for me to say because I'm on the creative side, and the creators in general are tiny a bit more aware of these problems than I'd say the financial aspects and the marketing aspects of this. And the big companies, of course, it's much harder to change big companies than it is to change for small companies. And it really depends on the spectrum of how you consider gaming is a complicated thing. It's not artistic instrument in all its forms. I mean, you can have from Tetris to, you know, a casino game on a mobile phone, on, you know, the type of games I do. You know, you have a broad spectrum of games, and arguably some of them are not pieces of art at all. They can't be. Their goal is not to be at all, you know, expressing narrative and or stories and or emotions. They're just meant to basically leverage money through cognitive biases in players, and that's about it. So it's a bit of a complex thing, but I'd say little by little, yes, but never forget that first and foremost, we are kind of corrupted by the fact that still the industry needs to make a ton of money. Sorry, I just destroyed the atmosphere here.
I had another general question for everyone, which is, how do you see the elements of the community that are online, like the racist and sexist elements? How do you see that translate into the physical spaces for the community, like conventions, competitions, or like cosplay groups? And how can we make those spaces more inclusive?
actually the reverse is happening. So, gaming and digital spaces are just, they manifest what's in the real world. They're a microcosm of what's existing in like the real world, right? So so just like we have, ableism, homophobia, racism, we have all these things like in the physical spaces. Of course, we're people and we're going to take them into those spaces as well. So we're going to take them into the cosplay space, right? Where it's going to be unsafe for a lot of, women, femme presenting folks, trans folks, because, other spaces are not, particularly safe. And so I think that a lot of people are becoming more and more aware. I remember seeing there was a conference that actually they laid out like a code of conduct or like a behavior of like things that we're going to accept and things we're not going to accept. So I think it's important that a lot of those structures are, like do that to make sure that they're protecting, some of the most minoritized and most marginalized folks, who are participating like in a lot of those spaces. But I think this is, are we going to be able to fix it all? No, we can't fix it all. But I think, things like that, I remember League of Legends instituted like the tribunals that didn't really work, badge systems, trying to think of some of the other systems that people are trying to implement to like to encourage pro-social behavior. So I think that's one of those things that a lot of spaces, can do, because I mean, we're not, listen, 2021, I've been in my body for about 40 years now. I've experienced a lot of stuff, we won't be able to change a lot of what's happening, but we can just protect the spaces that we're in, from the harms. And we also have to make sure that we advocate, for other populations, I'm just thinking, I was on Twitter just a second ago, thinking about, protecting, women and femmes' right to like abortions and reproductive rights, like those, we have to advocate, like for other populations. And so hopefully those things are happening in like some of the gaming spaces.
This is a very good point. If I may add also, because we're talking about cosplaying in communities, there was a question. There was another, I thought it was communities cosplaying in another space that you asked about. Sorry?
Competitions?
Sorry, say that again?
Competitions, like video game
Competition.
competitions?
Yeah, right. Okay. So more in the, you mean in the esports competitive section? Right. Yeah, because those are three different things, and it's from a community aspect, and I can vouch for what I've been saying for Spiritfarer, which was from the get-go a game with a more wholesome approach. The community never had any problem. I mean, I was completely scared because every video game developer is scared by their own community because it can be probably problematic and toxic. But lo and behold, if you actually create a game that is not about extreme and intense competition, it is not about extreme violence, and is not about winning at all cost, then people who come play the game are not this way at all. They're just like kind, lovely people, and that's about it. And it's about having spaces in gaming which are striving to do something else. I don't know if games that are extremely competitive can actually get away from toxicity. Maybe they will. I'm not exactly a specialist, but some games might have a bit more of success in there. But in general, you have to admit that a game that promotes a certain behavior will attract people who basically like having and behave this way. It's pretty simple. That's sometimes problematic. As for competitions, again, I'm not a specialist, but it's really about, again, to me, the main problem more in competition is the lack of women player, and it can be said also because from the get-go, you have communities that are extremely not just success oriented, but can be a bit locker room context in which have a bunch of dudes playing together, and they kind of that being dudes, they feel like alpha male is the way to go, and they kind of at an age where it feels cool for them to be this way, and they kind of shove aside and be extremely aggressive towards female players. So it's more a matter of making sure that people in those spheres respect one another. So you have to have more probably coaching and making sure that people are evolve in a context in which they are how to say that, they're being sensitized anyway. Then when they can actually understand that it's a problem to behave this way. As for cosplay, everyone is welcome. Are there toxic problems in the cosplay community? Yes. Yeah. You said yes, Kishonna, but that's just like confirms it. Yeah.
Oh, I can say more about cosplay.
Yeah.
Women and femme presenting folks are not safe in
Right.
cosplay. Well, there's a lot of harassment, a lot of sexual assault. And I think there were like a few years ago, I think there was somebody who shared like their story and their experiences on Twitter, like with one of like the organizers of like a pretty big, cosplay, like, convention or whatever. And this person was protected and shielded because this was a nice dude that everybody liked. And then nobody believed her. Nobody believed, what she
That's right. I remember
said.
the story.
So
Yeah.
absolutely. So there are some problems, in those spaces, but like you said, we can construct safety around a lot of these spaces to make sure that, we're not complicit, and to make sure that there's like a process, to either correct the offending behavior or make sure people just get the F out of that space, right? They shouldn't be there if they are especially predatory and are continually harming. Yeah.
Speaking of that, I really like the idea of creating sort of safe spaces in that regard, and esports and elsewhere in cosplay. And I wonder if there's been any response to the role of the U.S. Army's own esports gaming team. I'm just wondering, I remember when the sort of Army was recruiting and high schools, there's a lot of counter recruitment efforts and trying to create spaces that were demilitarized. And I wonder if we're seeing something like that happening within gaming communities at the same time.
Do you have thoughts on that, Tanner?
I've got some pieces.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just wondering what that would look like, because I remember sort of even in Counter-Strike and other games that were sort of the early sort of, first-person shooter multiplayer games, and people would go in and sort of, do digital sort of peace graffiti, right, on virtual walls and so on, to sort of try to raise consciousness about the harms of real war. But I don't know what's been really happening in the esports gaming community these days in response to the Army's own sort of team that's purposed to recruit people within the esports competitions, right, to become actual U.S. military personnel to serve. So, I mean, it would be interesting to look in more detail at that, but I don't have any files really open on that at the moment.
I've been really concerned with, the military's involvement with HBCUs and HSIs, historically Black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions, because they have a really heavy presence. They're spending a lot of money in those spaces, and they're providing a pathway like into esports, but you also have to think what's on the flip side. Like what do these folks have to give you like in return? And I don't think we're critical enough, right? Because a lot of HBCUs are like struggling like financially, so a lot of them would be like, oh, thank you for the money, we can provide like scholarships and do things like that. So I get that, but then on the other hand, like for me, when I put that I put the comment, when you said, like, because the origins of that is like military, so can they demilitarize like kinds of spaces? And I just don't know, because there's still always that, the military industrial complex is just gonna be that, right? They have their ends, and so I don't have high hopes for that, especially not stemming from how it's currently constructed, like from the arms and extensions of the military. I don't have high hopes.
I mean, I wonder then in that regard, if it becomes ever more challenging to sort of problematize or complicate these sort of, culture and racial and sexist stereotypes, in the absence again about bringing about bigger changes in society. It's kind of like a chicken or egg. Do you start with the sort of prefigurative gaming community spaces, you work at that very localized level, or do you sort of try to go sort of macro level and then down to the meso and the micro? You do bring me back and forth at the same time, and it all works together. But just so much war relies upon stereotypes of others, and so much of nationalism does, and it just in general. So it's challenging.
Yeah, I think, Tanner, to your point, I mean, it is kind of very difficult because how do you address it? Do you go for the micro or the macro? And Kishonna, you actually mentioned earlier that it is kind of like a circle in a way in how certain mentalities and ideas that exist in society are end up being represented in video games, but then those video games end up maybe influencing or in some way representing themselves and showing themselves in society. It's like a circular kind of model in that sense. So I mean, I don't really have a golden answer for that. I mean, what do you address first? But yeah, I just thought it was interesting to note that I don't think there really is a golden answer that a perfect way to really address the stereotypes and so on, because it exists on the macro level in society, but it also exists, within these video games, and it's just a cycle that keeps going. And it's a lot of our research, Tanner, actually, because we did a huge literature review for the thesis. A lot of it had to do with kind of the shift from I guess Islamophobia on that topic specifically, how it shifted within history from the East over to the West throughout time. And all of this is to say that the topic really is just difficult to address because it involves historical context, political context. It's just one huge kind of cycle that goes on, and it kind of connects to every facet of society. I will say, though, that if we're going to be talking about like, where do you address it? Where do you start in terms of going to these stereotypes, and then what do you do with them? I mean, sure, yeah, one way is to touch base with the video games themselves. And how can we kind of address the stereotypes within these video games? Well, one way, for example, I think, is having people who are represented in these video games. Maybe Nick, you can comment on this in some kind of capacity. People who are represented, or the types of people represented, to be involved in the process. So for example, if people are developing Call of Duty games, maybe have Muslim or Arab people be present to, I don't know if we should say play test, but provide the perspectives or ideas during the development process of what maybe might be a more accurate representation or of what's happening in the video game. I don't know, Nick, how practical that is, or if anything like that's been attempted before on a kind of serious level. But just off the top of my head, that's kind of one idea that could be used to really address the issue of racialization, the stereotypes in society, and specifically within video games.
Yeah, well, I think this is the answer, actually. This is the if everything had to be, summarized in one point, which is the game should be made by a more diverse group of people, and it will reflect, it will show that different perspectives have been taken into account by making those games. I can give you an example of a game I worked in, which was Assassin's Creed Origin. It's a game in which you play Bayek, which is an Ptolemaic Egyptian guy at the basis of the Assassin's Creed as a story. Anyway, and back then I was joining from Watch Dogs 2, which was an okay game. In Watch Dogs 2, the lead character is a black male, and he's kind of cool, but he's been created by white people. And in my opinion, it shows. I'm not a black person, but I could tell that, yeah, it doesn't feel that legit. I mean, he feels cool. I like him, but still, it doesn't feel so right. Whereas in Assassin's Creed Origin, I was joining a friend of mine called Mustafa Marash, and he's Moroccan. And actually, Ubisoft opened a studio in Casablanca in Morocco. It was in the beginning of the 2000, maybe in 2004, something like this. And a whole bunch of very talented Moroccan developers joined Ubisoft Montreal. Again, in the past, I worked with a very talented art director called Mohamed Gambouz, and he was the art director who basically recreated, the Revolutionary Paris, so a French thing. But yet, in making Assassin's Creed Origin, we had a very diverse team, a bit on the male gender, heavily skewed on the male gender, but still, it was people from different backgrounds and different ethnicities, and we had an approach which was interesting because even if we were talking about an age period, it's the Ptolemaic Egypt is complicated. It's not really the historical antique Egyptian society. It's an Egyptian society that has been replaced by Greek people after the conquest of Alexander the Great. Anyway, but it's still another culture, another time period, and we tried as much as we could and as diversely as we could tackle the subject as seeing this from different angles. And of course, the Islamic angle was extremely important for us, as well as when we did Assassin's Creed Revelation based in Istanbul in Turkey, was in Constantinople back then. But still, yeah, my opinion is that definitely it's something you can do. Now, to actually make sure that this happens is a bit more complicated. And to be honest, I think the game was good because it just happened to be this way. And people were in the company, there were good developers, good designers, and they were just like making the game. Now, to basically enforce that is a bit more complicated. Yes, what we can do is basically hire subcontractors or sensitivity groups for different types of topics. Could be racism, ableism, could be gender topics. But it should come from within, and not do something that, hey, I have this, can you check this out, is always less good than I'm different and I'm talking from a different perspective. So it's more about hiring process and recruiting process. Many companies try to work with hiring biases, which can be extremely problematic in the video games industry, because you come with a big group of people who have been making games for a long while, and these people are massively white dudes. So then you say, okay, but how can I actually integrate more women, more people, women of color, people of color in general, for different ethnicity and backgrounds? And yeah, it has to be extremely conscious from a company to hire with that mindset. Otherwise, it just won't happen. So it's evolving. Some companies do, some companies don't, and it has to come from within, in my opinion.
If I could just reply to that just very briefly,
Sure.
I think it's really, and I mentioned this in the text chat, which I know not everyone can see. I think it's really interesting actually to have someone like yourself, Nick, to be here, because you're providing a really unique perspective on all of this, because you're an insider, right? I mean, you've worked on games, and you've mentioned Assassin's Creed and Army of Two, which is actually one of the games that Tanner and I, researched for our work, and so on. So I think it's interesting, and you're saying things now that are getting me thinking about stuff that Tanner and I have written about, and kind of thinking like, oh, what about this? What about that? For example, you just mentioned how like with Assassin's Creed, you did have a decently diverse team in on the process and helping with it. And I think that's interesting, because a game like Assassin's Creed has a lot to do with history, and you can visit so many different points in history and make so many diverse types of characters, where I think there's a lot of freedom to have, I don't know if I'd say positive representations, but a lot of freedom to have kind of diverse representations. But then it gets me thinking, maybe that would be a little bit more difficult to do with war-themed video games, because war is obviously a very sensitive subject. And so, and you mentioned this again, Nick, yourself, about how a lot of the time developers in a way are kind of, I don't want to say forced, but their hands are, you use the word corrupted, I guess. I'll just use the same word, by the demand, right? It's kind of a supply and demand. So even if we were to have, Muslims and Arabs or whoever be involved in a war game development, like a Call of Duty game, I wonder how successful that would be, because the developers and publishers still have to meet the demands of the audiences, and I wonder how would audiences react to more diverse representations of Muslims and Arabs, or different types of enemies in the games, because if it's not Muslims and Arabs, it has to be someone else, right?
Yeah.
And I think that Assassin's Creed might be a little bit easier, because history has so many different places to pick from, whereas when it comes to war, I mean, it always seems like someone has to be the enemy, someone's going to be upset, and developers have to meet demands of the audiences. So it's just interesting how maybe it differs between types of games, I guess, in that sense.
Right. I don't want to hug the mic for too long, but yeah, it's something, Tanner, you said in the chat as well, which is it's mainly about perceived, audience by higher ups and execs in general. And by the way, that layer of corporate structure is even more wider and even more male. It's like almost 90% of those people are white men. It's a perceived audience. To be honest, I feel it is. Sometimes it's about, there is quite a ton of money. I'm trying to stay polite, I would say another word, but a ton of money involved in there. And people would say, we have to make sure that this is bankable. We have to make sure that we actually make a profit out of this. So we go to safe route, and that's what they see. That's what they believe. It's a really narrow focus, but that's what they think it should be the market audience for a game like this. So yeah, it's really about perceived audience. Now I'm extremely convinced that if we actually used our big boy pants, it's a bit of a racial, not racial, but it's a gender stereotype. But if we actually were courageous and we actually ship more games with a more diverse cast, it would work perfectly well. And yeah, you would have a handful of, maybe not a handful, but a kind of a Gamergate reaction to things. And as it's always the case anyway, people just being complaining about the fact that, oh, this time it's a woman in charge with a gun, and it's a World War I, and a woman should never have been there. It's like, okay, just sure, you can think that, fine, you go back to your corner and then cry about it, but then tons of other people will like it, and they will, oh cool, that's different, that's nice. I'm perfectly convinced, maybe I'm being naive, but there is the majority of the audience is completely okay with this, and they would completely be okay with having racial stereotype being erased as much as we can from video games, and the cast being more diverse. And yeah, war is a bit different because war is, as the motto would say, told by the winners. And if it's a historical war more specifically, it's a bit more complex. And it's fun because I don't know if it's fun, but again, I'm saying this, I'm French, and it's very rare that French people will actually complain about the stereotypes against them, but still they happen. And same for German people. I don't know, the other day, I don't know why I had an absence, and I watched a superhero movie, and I think it was Wonder Woman, the first one. And in that movie, she is fighting against Nazis from World War I. So you have like German people who are really, Nazis are bad. We all agree on this. Nazis are terrible fucking people. Sorry, Nazis are terrible people. It's fine. We all know that they are terrible. But then, I'm not defending at all any form of regime who promotes war or violence. But you have to admit that the Prussia and Germany in World War I, they were not as bad as the others. They were all terrible people anyways. But in that movie, the stereotype of German equal bad was extremely popular and still prevailed. So from a historical perspective, I mean, we can do better. And I'm quoting a movie, which is easy, but video games industry know better. We basically propagate stereotypes all the time. So yeah, I'm sure that if we were allowed to do it, I'm saying I can, but other people in the industry might not have that ability of freedom to make those creative choices. But still, it's I'm sure it would work, and it's really a mental barrier that comes from up there that basically has no reason to exist. Well, that's my opinion, at the very least.
I just want to throw out one more question that bounces off what we've been talking about in terms of promoting diversity within the industry. How do we promote diversity while also avoiding tokenism? And any of the panelists can feel free to take that to begin with.
Appreciate you asking that. As they were talking, I started thinking about hiring practices. And I remember so many of the comments that I heard from like folks inside the industry. They said, Kishonna, the applicant pool is just not diverse, so we can't diversify, right? And I hear that loud and clear. Yeah, absolutely. So which is why a lot of these companies are having to rely on the consultancy like framework, to try to get folks in there, or hire, the local historian or whoever like to help, consult when they're trying to do these things. But I think a lot of these conversations, often go back. So the thing I asked was like, well, how can you all be invested in diversifying the applicant pool? And some of those conversations really start on the playground, like when kids are, constructed, when these gender roles are constructed of like, okay, girls do this and boys do that. And of course there's a binary, because there's no even consideration of, folks who might not even, non-binary folks, trans folks, there's no conversation around that, but they're really saying, okay, boys need to go this route, girls go this route. And those kind of conversations, when we think about like the leaky pipe in STEM, I think that's the framework. I think that's, how folks like use that about how, often, when we think about just along the lines of like a singular gender analysis, we lose so many women inside these spaces, because the spaces haven't been constructed for them, right? And so you have years and decades before a person even like reaches that point, to have, to create like the structure of like, okay, this is a space by dudes for dudes, right? But then when you think, racially, I remember, when you all remember when I think Alex Hanna, she was really advocating about this, and Timnit Gebru, the firing of Timnit Gebru, whenever they really did like this expose of like Google's hiring practices, right? And we can assume that other tech companies are not that far off, from like these hiring practices. So there was like a disparaging of, for instance, folks who got their computer science degrees from Howard University and from Fisk or Tennessee State, all of these like the HBCUs, like they were like, okay, they're not. That's not the filter. That's not the pipeline in which they want to receive like different kinds of applicants. So just even a lot of the practices, the recruiting practices are very racialized. I would say racist. They're very sexist. They're very racist. So you're not going to find the applicants because you're looking for that person who's from the Silicon Valley, that went to Stanford, that did an internship at Facebook, and had parents who were at MIT. I mean, I don't know. Like really, there's like a really narrow way in which we've defined what a computer scientist looks like, or what an engineer looks looks like. And I think there's like a cultural shift that needs to happen. It has to be a complete paradigm shift in our way of thinking, right? You know, because then if we're saying that certain degrees and certain people, you know, I'm thinking about, you know, James Damore, the Google Bro memo. Y'all remember that dude from like a few years back? Like, he was not the only one who thought that women were less than in engineering, right? You know, and you're completely erasing like the history of folks who have always been there. You know, women aren't new to computer science and engineering. People of color are not new to like these spaces, but then we always talk like, oh, we don't know where to find them. We don't know where to get them. Like, we always talk like, you know, there's some anomaly, like some unicorn off in the corner that we can't get access to. And that's just not true. The structures have created these inaccessible practices. They've created these barriers that makes it hard for those people to even get in those spaces, like from Drum. And also, we're putting a lot of weight on like, okay, if they're there, then they're going to contribute magically to this team. I can't wait to hear what you have to say, you woman, about your ideas. That doesn't happen. Their ideas are stolen. You know, they are criticized. They're silenced, you know, when they're on these teams. So we have to think about what are the cultures in which these folks are, these minoritized, marginalized folks are even going into these spaces with, right? You know, I think we think that the presence of them is going to solve all these problems, and it's just not. So many people are scared to speak. Somebody was just sharing with me about, you know, a Black woman's ideas. You know, I think there was a Black woman who contributed to like the Spotify's Wrapped, like the end of the year, like wrap up, like of your listening analytics. It was a Black woman who did that. And I had no idea. Her idea was stolen by folks in Spotify. She was in an internship like then, right? And so I'm like, you know, here we are, we're sharing these ideas, but then they get stolen. And then, so we can't get hired. Our voices are silenced. Like, so there are like a whole lot of layers, you know, and I wish I had a better answer for you. I really wish I did. You know, I hate to be the person that does this on the panel, but I think we got to be real about that. So thank you for asking that question. You know, we have to think, you know, that the people are there, you know, they're more than qualified, but I think, you know, there's the climate, and the climate of these spaces are going to have to completely change before we can actually do something better and something different than we have been doing. Okay, I'm stopping. I'm so sorry.
No, that was awesome. Yeah, again, so to go back to the idea of tokenism in the industry, I don't say I can say anything better than what Kishonna said, but it's it's really a mindset of having, you know, companies that don't want to hire people just for being there and represent something that they don't care about, you know, and just like they can put that in their websites. Hey, we have Black people too. No, it just doesn't work this way. And yeah, exactly as Kishonna said, people just magically being there, they're staying in their corner, and then they will leave after 6 months or a year because they're not consolidated. People do not care about their presence, and it's really a corporate mindset. You know, it's you know, it tends to be, you know, when you have a boys club doing things, they won't, you know, involve anyone, and even people beyond the alpha male, you know, stereotypical, you know, type of presentation, which is quite, you know, prevalent in the video games industry, as you can have seen during the Blizzard years quite recently. And again, you know, up until last year, Blizzard was still considered as being like the nicest company you can work for and the best, you know, in terms of fantasy world and video game practices, and lo and behold, look what happened. So yeah, it's really about having people who want to include other voices, and it takes efforts, and most people think that it just magically, you know, is still when you have someone on the team, or talking back to the concept of the games themselves, or on screen as well, same thing. You know, it's whatever you do, if you just like think, hey, I have a Black character in my game, or a woman character as a main character, if you don't really take into account what this actually means and how this actually works in the continuum of what the game is, then it's like, it has some value, but it's, to me, it feels meaningless. And as a creative effort, it's also a bit, you know, lazy, in the sense that you just think that, hey, no, I did my part. No, you didn't do anything, actually. You just had someone on screen who looks different than you, good, but then that's about it.
So I wanted to jump in and ask a question based off what, Kishonna, you were just talking about. How do we begin that cultural shift or sea change that all of you have been hinting at in a society that has become increasingly reluctant and, in fact, engaged in substantive refusal to talk about race? So how do we begin to address that cultural shift that needs to happen in a society that refuses substantively to address issues of race, because we have chosen instead to embrace post-racialism and those kind of lenses or ways of thinking.
So I'll just start just very briefly. I don't really have, Kishonna said it looks like I have something to say. I don't really have again, a perfect answer to this question. I will say though, I do think that we have seen the potential for change when you look right now, the tools that we have as a society compared to 50 years ago. And the main thing I'm thinking of is the internet and social media. I think that we have seen in different types of ways that there's been pressure in certain topics and issues where social media really has pushed people to make a change. And it's not because these issues didn't exist before, it's only because they're now being made more aware, or people are being made more aware of these issues that exist thanks to social media. So I think, I mean, it sounds like kind of a basic answer, but I do think spreading awareness and having people be aware of these issues is kind of the key, because a lot of people aren't super duper aware of the issues that exist. So I think social media is one tool that we could use. You know, I mean, I think all of us being here and doing this event is already one example of a step in the right direction. Not to say that we've solved anything magically, but I'm just saying things like this, community events, where we're having discussion panels and discourse over these topics, where people are being made aware of racialization in games, Islamophobia, and so on. I think that's kind of at the most basic level something that we can do, and utilizing, you know, social media to kind of spread these events, spread this message, and just make people more aware. I know it's not, that's obviously very much easier said than done. But I think that at least if we look in that direction and kind of view social media as a tool that we can use to spread awareness, that maybe that'll act as a decent first step towards addressing the issue on a larger macro scale.
And to just go off of what Taha just said, I think social media like kind of matters. So think back like a few months. Remember when all these companies like issued like, you know, Black Lives Matter statements, you know, the affirmative statement of like, yes, Black Lives Matter. And then whenever they had the affirmative statement of like, you know, stop Asian hate, you know, like those are like big cultural shifts that I didn't think I would ever see like in my lifetime. So I don't want to take it lightly that they aren't responding. But going back to what Nick said, that I thought was like so important, you know, he was talking about like audience, like think about, you know, a lot of these corporate entities, they're going to have to really like detach from their imagined and perceived audience and start embracing like other audiences, you know, because there's no way, you know, because I'm thinking about like with gaming, you know, the target audience in gaming, you know, it's white dudes, right? We know that, you know, that's who, like research has confirmed this, like, you know, like white dudes are the ones that get marketed to and catered to, you know, advertisements are made, you know, to fit, you know, the white dude brain, right? A lot of times the adolescent white dude brain, but you know, the demographic is getting older and older, and like the marketing is like shifting with them, right? So it's like the 30-something white dude, right? But I think that, you know, I think there was like a recognition, like a moment. And of course, this was from like a lot of the activist work that, you know, Black and Indigenous and Latinx and Asian folks like we're doing like on the streets and utilizing social media, that is like, hey, y'all need to pay attention to us. We matter. Our dollars matter. We're going to take things elsewhere. So think about like Nike campaigns. Like think about, you know, I saw a Nike campaign and there was like a fat woman, like somebody that looks like me, a fat Black woman that was like, you know, doing like, I've never seen like fat people like advertising like a brand like Nike, right? There were visibly queer people that were advertising. Now, are they doing it for, you know, the clickbait and for the woke crowd? You know, sure, but so what? Like, I think it's forcing them to have to do something. I don't think we've yet had that moment in gaming. I thought Gamergate was our moment. I really did. I really feel like a lot of us, like, I think we missed the ball. I don't want to say we missed the ball, because a lot of us were just protecting ourselves, like literally protecting our physical and our physical selves and our online selves because of all the harassment that was happening. But I think there was a moment where I think a lot of these corporations were probably like listening and say, oh, are we complicit in this? And my answer is like, yes, you have been complicit in the thing that we are now calling Gamergate because of your devaluation of like women and femme presenting folks because of, you're not targeting and catering. So we have been rendered powerless and we have been marginalized, like within these games and in your hiring practices and the advertising practice, like it's a whole ecology around this. It's not just one thing. So I know we're talking about representations in games, but I think, this conversation has made it very clear that there are a lot of things that are going into this. The audience matters, right? Hiring practices matters. The culture is not just like a singular thing. So I think it's really important that as we're making that shift, that a lot of these corporate entities are recognizing that there are a lot more people out here than who we've just been targeting like for these last few decades. And I think that's where like a lot of the changes are gonna happen, because like Nick said, the audience is gonna demand better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's a hard question for me, and it's for us, because as I gather, Taha and Tanner, you live in Canada as well. We are fortunate enough to there are tons of problems in Canada, but still, we feel quite, in a different space than the US. And I completely understand your question. It's a bit, disheartening to see what's going on. It feels like it's such a a never-ending well of it's a bit of a hopeless situation. Yet, as completely agree with what Kishonna said, even if I tend to loathe big corporations and I think they do anything for a profit, and it's still a somewhat of a positive thing that, exactly as Kishonna said, those big corporations, they do have tons of metric, ton of analysts about, what really consumers are shifting towards or leaning towards in terms of positioning. And it's quite reassuring to see that big companies like Nike's, even the GAFAs, they actually try to cater to more, younger, more, inclusive audience. But it probably have the side effects of, people on the other side having that even more stirred up into like, yeah, no, this isn't what we don't want. And then the political parties, they are their own type of corporations. They cater to their own audience as well. And they see this and they use that. But no, yeah, that's it's an audience thing. It's really not to quote Marx, but it's really power to the people. It's really a matter of, the audience shifting towards something that they really want as a whole, so yeah, so you vote with your wallet basically in there.
Do y'all remember that phrase? Like it was like go woke, get broke or something like that, about how like a lot of the alt-right brand of folks were like, okay, all these diverse representations, all of this focus like on, Black Lives Matter. And then, I mean, were they trying to like boycott companies? Because I still think that a lot of these companies are still raking in a lot of money for their games. And but it's like this thinking that like, okay, if you are going to cater to that social justice crowd or that woke crowd, then we're gonna leave. And I'm just like, well, why haven't y'all left yet? Because I was just in Call of Duty the other day, and it sounded like them folks are still there. I'm trying not to cuss. I'm so sorry. It still sounds like them folks are still there. So I'm like, I thought y'all said y'all was leaving. Like, where y'all going?
I mean, I know. I mean, they've been launching this campaign against this sort of myth, this kind of ludicrous conspiracy theory of the cultural Marxists taking over gaming and film and the government, and like as if Biden's a socialist or something. Like it's what? But and you wonder how far those arguments are going to go. And they say we're going to withdraw our consumer dollars, we're going to go to other platforms, and they do in some respect. But I'm like, great, all the power to you. Go off to some marginalized platform, exit, and then maybe you'll be shut down eventually once they realize you're white nationalists in disguise. So like let's just I'm all for deplatforming them. We're actually sort of letting them sort of marginalize themselves. But as you say, Kishonna, like they are still kind of playing these games and they are still paying to play them, and they still do have this significant role and influence within these mainstream gaming communities and cultures. And I just wonder, like in the context of even sort of, game chat forums or real-time chat in games, like if there are political arguments happening now, from those sort of on the left or the liberal center or those on the far right or white nationalist right, like have those spaces themselves become like a train of political battle? Between these forces that are reshaping the United States and the world right now. We have on the left sort of the democratic socialist left, and you've got sort of the liberal left, and then you've got kind of like the far right, which is now so mainstream as well, and which is terrifying, from an outsider's point of view. It's affecting things in Canada at the same time. But are we seeing those types of discussions happening in the context of real play and of live stream play and of I'm just curious what people are observing these days.
Yeah, you guys actually reminded me, all three of you reminded me in different ways of discussions that we're seeing on YouTube. Maybe Nick, you might see this as a developer yourself. I don't know how closely you guys follow the comments and comment sections on YouTube videos. But someone, I forget who it was, mentioned, with Battlefield 5, how they had the woman in the trailer, and that like broke the internet because people were like, oh, it's not authentic. It's that's not what we want in our war game and everything. I think when it comes to YouTube videos, they're just kind of these trailers, all these marketing materials for video games. You can almost, when you watch a trailer, you can almost predict the dislike bar to like bar ratio on a video, because it's sad to say that a lot of video game culture, we all know how they can be. They're almost like adverse to any type of diversity in some sense, because it's catered mostly towards a male white audience, and they have their ideas about anytime a woman or a Black person or a Muslim is represented in a way that doesn't match up with how they've usually been represented. They think there's some type of agenda at play, kind of socialist or Marxist agenda. I mean, I think when it comes to YouTube, unfortunately, they recently just removed the dislike bar, which is its own topic. But again, we see this discourse happen in the comment sections of these videos when they get dislike bombed, and they have people in the comments shouting and going like, oh, these representations shouldn't be here. They're doing this for this reason. There's this agenda at play. It's kind of crazy. Like you can just predict it when watching a trailer. If you see someone who is represented in if you see someone, for example, from the LGBT community, you can almost predict that there's going to be complaints about it, because they assume that there's some type of agenda at play, even though it's just a representation of, for example, with The Last of Us 2, there was a scene between two women kissing, and people immediately felt, oh, there's an agenda happening, but they never say that when in the hundreds of games when there's, heterosexual relationships. It's sad to see, but yeah, it's almost so predictable when it comes to the gaming community, and you can very clearly see that in the comment sections of many video game trailers.
All right, so we're almost out of time, I think, but does anyone have any burning questions that they have?
I have a question.
Oh yeah.
Hi guys. I really liked what you had to say and I learned a lot. But anyway, here's my question. Why is it always in video games 2 women kissing and never 2 men? Or you don't see like blind people or disabled portrayals? And why are the foreigners, like in TV and books, always portrayed as villains?
A lot, I call that, I'm gonna say a bad word. Please forgive me, but if that's okay, it's it's the fuckability factor. Because think about like all the queer romances that we often see. They're very hot women, hypersexualized like hot women, very rarely. I remember going through, it's a good time to plug Adrian Shaw at Temple, did an LGBTQ archive. So I think you can probably just search up LGBTQ archive, where, her and her team just kind of went through all the games and kind of did like a content analysis of like every instance of like a queer body or queer love, queer romance, or innuendo queer, kind of like story in there. But I think that there's still, especially in media, undesirable bodies, right? We don't want to see fat bodies. We don't want to see disabled bodies. We don't, and think about it, especially with all the homophobia, especially, we don't want to see gay men. I remember I was just reading like a whole thread where people were mad at a little boy in a kitchen set saying, oh, you're going to make him like a whole host of homophobic and heterosexist words, like insert there, so, but I think, our society still has like a longer way to go, whereas, there are some acceptable queerness, that we see in like the media, and there are some that we just don't want to see. Think about like, especially when gay men like are always like the friend to a heterosexual couple, like in movies and media, like these are like the tropes. Like we don't want to see you in love. We don't want to see, I remember, and I'm so sorry. I know that the time is running out, but you all remember on Empire where they gave I can't, the woman that played Precious. I can't remember her name, her actual name, but I think there was like a love scene with her, like having sex, and people were like, what is this? We don't want to see this dark skinned, fat black woman, you know, having sex, because we haven't sexualized her. We have actually asexualized and desexualized her through like the mammification process. So these are happening like a lot across like other kind of cultures, but media just doesn't want to show that. So gaming has really adopted a lot of those representations from like other spaces like film and TV and cinema. I'm shutting up. I'm sorry. I know it's time to go. I'm sorry. Thank you for that question. Great question.
Keep going, Kishonna.
This was great, by the way. This is awesome.
Do I have any other questions? Anyone? No. All right. I think that's about it. To wrap up, it is now past way the time, 2:45, and it's already been an hour 15. It's been a wonderful time meeting all of you. I love hearing all your opinions, and it's been an incredible experience having you all here. I'm very grateful for the experience. Thank you so much. Take a round of applause. Yeah.
Thank you for the conversation. It was really awesome. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Definitely enjoyed being here and hearing perspectives from all different kinds of people.
Pleasure and a privilege. So nice to chat with everyone. Thank you so much.
Let's do this again. Invite us back anytime. We take this on the road.
Definitely.
Thank you very much.